I'd like to introduce Claire O'Neill now to talk about open innovation in action. So Claire is the founder of Original Ventures. Claire helps organisations transform themselves into more innovative places, improving their capability for developing new products and services or turning around their business model. Her work includes developing business strategy, providing business coaching for startups and innovation managers, directing innovation programs, and pulling together complex multi-partner collaborations, the end goal being a lasting effect on business performance, adaptability, and competitiveness. So I'd like to welcome Claire to the stage. Oops.
Thanks, Jo. Good morning, everyone. Now, my voice is giving out a little bit today, so I'll apologise in advance for any coughing and spluttering. So I'm a business consultant. I focus on business strategy and innovation management, helping clients become more effective at developing ideas into new products. And those clients might be anything from a small advanced engineering company through to Manchester Airports Group, or indeed SBC. And I've been working with them on their approach to open innovation since before they opened their doors for business. And this is a long-term gain to see how an open innovation campus could actually develop and can it become more than the sum of its parts. So open innovation was originally defined as any external collaboration. And obviously that means immediately it's not necessarily something new for everyone. But at the time that the phrase was coined a few years ago, across the business spectrum, there was a well-defined disease called not invented here syndrome, which many large R&D-based companies suffered from. And the rise of open innovation has helped them to see that ideas and talent are everywhere, not just in their own buildings, and that's an asset that they should really tap into. So for some companies, open innovation heralds quite a deliberate shift in strategy and how they approach their own R&D. And they're doing this not just by traditional methods such as funding PhDs in universities, but also through methods such as crowdsourcing, which we never would have seen just a few years ago. And within this, we see quite changing attitudes to sharing data. So if you were here last year, you'd have seen representatives from several different multi-pharma partnerships that are sharing pre-competitive data and best practice so that the quality of the work of the whole sector can rise up a few notches. And open innovation has become a sort of umbrella term for this shift in strategy and these various methods of collaboration. So that brings us on to the environment in which all this is happening, the innovation ecosystem that supports a good idea in their journey, if Martina allows me to use the word, of transformation into products and services and processes. And if we take SBC, for example, and the reach that it has through all of its various connections and networks represented by these ripples coming out from SBC at the centre. There are the businesses that SBC is connected with, either because they're tenants or whatever, and they each have their own reach and networks, sometimes coinciding at points with the SBC network. Then there are the academic and clinical institutions that it's connected with, again, each with their own reach. And then for the sake of a simpler diagram, the rest of the world, which might be investors, government departments, patient groups, and so on. And for any individual organisation, the more populated this diagram is, the more networks they're connected into, the more diverse those networks are, then the better chance that organisation has in a competitive world where innovation matters. So this is based on organisations, but we could use a similar sort of diagram to look at the types of activity that matter in innovation. And there could be all sorts of things in here, but certainly connecting ideas, connecting people through networking, and all of the questioning and experimenting that goes on at the heart of a successful innovation environment. And from there, it's quite interesting to look at the individual people and how they act within the innovation ecosystem, and who exactly would get job titles like these. So within your own organisation, who is it that naturally fits into these roles, and how can you make the most of them? The communicators and the connectors could be at any level in the organisation, and they'll play an increasingly important role in an environment where collaborative innovation is on the rise. And as an open innovation hub, SBC looks at this on the scale of the whole sector, and it's built up its network accordingly with on-site connections and virtual connections and strategic partnerships. And we'll be hearing more about some of those throughout the day. What I'm going to do for the next couple of minutes is delve into the SBC environment a bit further. So they now have 47 businesses on campus. That's quite a big jump from last year. And if we ask those businesses to define themselves, this is what we get. And some of them tick more than one box, which is why it adds up to more than 47. And of those 47 businesses, 75% are IP-based, the rest are service providers and the like. And as a total, in their lifetime, they've acquired over £50 million in investment and grant income. And I love the story that goes with this total. The SBC team had one of those fundometers made up, you know, the sort of thing that looks like a thermometer, and a marker goes up as the tenants acquire more investment. And they had it on display for just a few months before it became obsolete, because they busted through the top level much more quickly than they thought they would. So they're now having to make a new one, and hopefully there's a higher up, a more challenging marker at the top of that. So in terms of collaboration, open innovation, so on at SBC, one figure that jumped out at me was that 50% of these businesses are now developing a new business idea as a result of SBC introductions. And those introductions happen through a lot of different routes. There's the personal networks of Martino and the team. There's the SBC experts panel of business advisors. There's the entrepreneur in residence. There's the Discover Assist program, which has introduced universities to tenant businesses. And there's a mentoring program that was launched last year. And of course, there's the tenant-to-tenant conversations that take place as well. And we would really like to benchmark this against other incubators. So I'm putting this call out again. I said it last year as well. If you're involved in tracking this sort of thing for an incubator, then please let us know if you're doing that or you know someone who is. So what will we track in more detail then? Obviously, as with any incubator, my remote control isn't working now. There we are. There's the, if you like, the traditional metrics, which of course they'll track like any incubator, such as the amount of investment tenants receive or how many jobs they create and so on. But as an open innovation hub, SBC is particularly interested in collaborations and the culture of collaboration that develops there. So they'll be looking at the number and the type of collaborations that develop, whether they develop as a result of the practical support that the tenants receive from SBC and their network. And also whether the campus manages to maintain the quite neighbourly environment that they've managed to build up so far, where we see quite a high level of informal conversations going on between tenants every day, as well as the more formal interactions. There's a lot of kind of chatting over the garden fence, and that's a very good thing for a collaborative environment. So the final thing I'm going to talk about is the crowd. Patients, carers, retired researchers, investors, inventors who work in the garden shed. All human life is out there, and they have ideas, and they have bank accounts. So the crowdsourcing of ideas, first of all, Mimit, which is based in Manchester, is a really interesting example of crowdsourcing. They go to medical professionals, but also patient groups and the like, to get them to define areas of unmet clinical need. And then those areas of need and potential solutions for them get a bit of support, a bit of proof of concept funding to get an idea off the ground. So it's a collaboration of the University of Manchester and 5 teaching hospitals around the city region. And it must be 7 or 8 years ago now, I helped them get started, get their kickstart funding. And they're now part of the Manchester Academic Health Science Centre. And SBC has carried out its first major Open Innovation Challenge in partnership with Mimit and the 5 academic health science centres across England. And we'll be hearing more about that later on this morning. We'll be meeting some winners, and there's a breakout session on it this afternoon as well. So crowdsourcing of ideas is one thing. Crowdfunding is, I think, getting a bit more traction now in this particular sector, certainly taken off in others. Here's just one example. So I'm on the board of the British Council for Prevention of Blindness, and we focus most of our work on developing regions across the world because 80% of blindness there is avoidable. It could either be prevented or treated. So we fund research and professional development for local eye doctors. So here's someone getting a scan of the back of their eye. So that's the retina that coats the inner surface of the eye. And this is routine stuff. Many of you have probably had this done as part of your regular eye examination. You put your face up to the machine and it takes a picture. And it would be great to do this, for example, around quite large rural areas in Africa. But these machines have a kind of perfect storm of unsuitability for being transported and used in those areas. They're expensive and fragile. They're heavy, they're bulky. You need to have an electricity supply to use them, and that can be an issue in itself sometimes. So there's a fantastic research fellow called Andrew Bostrus at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Excuse me. And he's come up with an alternative to this machine, which is about the size of a 10-pence piece. And it clips onto any make of smartphone that already has a built-in camera. And that effectively gives you a combined ophthalmoscope and retinal scanner, so it produces the same images as the big machine in the previous slide. And we think this is going to transform, absolutely transform, eye healthcare in developing regions, because it makes it so much more accessible. You don't need somebody particularly qualified to operate it, they just need to be trained in its use. They go off on a motorbike around all these remote villages. They have a little rucksack with some solar panels on it, which recharges the phone. They take the picture, they ping the picture over to a consultant who could be hundreds of miles away or thousands of miles away. The consultant can make a diagnosis and also uses Google Maps to mark exactly where that patient was, because there's not always an address. So it's not only identifying issues for individual patients, it's also telling those countries and those regions where their public healthcare programs for eye healthcare really need to be focused. So we funded the initial development of this, and Andrew and his team have had it in field trials for 2 years, and that's been going very well. But they needed to scale up the production, the actual manufacture of these little gizmos in order to do more widespread trials. So they needed £70,000 to do that, and they used an online crowdfunding website called Indiegogo, and they busted right through their initial target within a few weeks. The donations range from £10 to several hundred. They just closed this call earlier on this month, and that additional money they've got will simply be used to scale up their plans. So this will make more scanners for more healthcare workers in those regions, so that the next stage of the trials can be widened out. So the reason all this is worth mentioning is that certainly 10 years ago, and very probably 5 years ago, this just wouldn't have happened. The crowdfunding sites weren't really there so much. The crowdfunding as a thing, as a concept, wasn't really in the public consciousness so much. So there would have been fewer people aware of it and engaging with it and actually participating. So this kind of project would have just languished at that stage for much longer and not been driven forward so quickly. So holding that thought, here's something that tends to bug me. This is a model that's been around for a long time. It shows business, academia and government in what the policy wonks like to call the triple helix. And it gets referred to a lot with respect to how universities, with respect to how government stimulates and supports universities in their commercial activity and how those institutions interact with business. And I've used it myself a few years ago in public sector grant applications and that sort of thing. It's still used quite a bit, and it's out of date because the rise of open innovation has brought us the most unusual suspects of all, and that's the crowd. So when the bioscience sector, and indeed any sector, is looking at its innovation environment, I think it needs to stop using this triple-stranded model and look at something like this, because the crowd are telling us where there is unmet clinical need and therefore unmet market opportunities. And the crowd is collectively funding research in ways which we simply couldn't have imagined just a few years ago. So the message is, get ready for the crowd, get ready for the really unusual suspects, because they're out there and they're getting more active, and they could well help your research and your business in the future. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm happy to answer questions, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Claire, for a fascinating view there, and a lovely example. example from Peak Vision there on crowdfunding in action. So any particular questions for Claire? So we've got a question over here.
It's Mark from the... Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, it's Mark from the Innovation Forum. I wanted to ask you whether you could comment about the... or compare the models of the outcubator. I don't know if you've seen the recent publication in Nature Biotechnology from Christian Tidona from Heidelberg, and compare this with the Stevenage wonderful initiative of the Open Innovation Campus. And also, second question, do you think we need managers of the crowd to make it more efficient in terms of the interaction between the three different stakeholders? Thank you.
That's two good questions. You'll need to tell me more about the incubator just before you give the microphone away. The model there is...
Well, in principle, they... Hello? In principle, they are asking large pharma companies about the most sort of important problems for the pharma industry, and then they outsource the problems to a crowd of researchers who are initially working on these ideas in a sort of research space lab, and then once some of these ideas are mature enough to be commercial, they immediately take it in partnership of the pharma company to an incubator. That's why there's outsourcing and incubation combined.
Got you, yeah. So that's a really interesting model. I think answering your second question first, I don't think we should manage the crowd. I don't think we could anyway, and I'm not sure that we should, because really it's too organic, you know, it's too uncontrolled anyway. How do you control who sees what on Facebook and decides, oh yeah, I'll donate to that? You know, it's too random, and it should be random. I think what we can do is maybe support how much it's used and increase how much it's used in this sector in particular. You know, at SBC, we've always said that open innovation is only one tool in the box. It's not a panacea or an answer to everything, but it is underused in the life sciences sector. You know, if you look at digital or tech, it's used a lot more there. So I don't think we should manage the crowd, but we should certainly herd them in the right direction if we can through communications and that sort of thing. And I think the incubator sounds really interesting. It sounds actually rather like the, at least initially, the Open Innovation Challenge that SBC's been running on neurodegenerative diseases that I mentioned. It's about defining what are these great big hairy areas of need that we're all struggling with, and using the crowd, whoever's out there, to stimulate responses to that. I think the difference is that there's no assumption of eventual partnership or ownership on the part of the sponsors of the SBC challenge. But, you know, horses for courses. I think the more that we simply get those challenges out there, get everybody thinking about new solutions to this and bringing together different disciplines for that as well, you know, that technology convergence theme is quite important there too, then that's all good, it's all useful. One of my favourite quotes from last year's event was, ultimately we're all patients. And, you know, we all need a better answer to Alzheimer's and malaria and everything else. So, yeah, great stuff.
It's me. My name is Lars Gretzel from the Wellcome Trust. The crowdfunding idea sounds intriguing, but in practice, how on earth is that going to work? At the Wellcome Trust, we try to make sensible decisions as to what to fund, and that requires an awful lot of due diligence, and we don't always get it right. How on earth is the crowd ever supposed to do due diligence? How are they supposed to make qualified decisions? Isn't this just a recipe for enormous wasted resources?
Yeah, I like that actually, yeah. So, yeah, I'll come back in that and disagree completely, because the crowd, for the large part, is somebody who's got 10 quid, 50 quid to donate. They don't care about due diligence. They care about the fact that somebody who's blind and shouldn't be could be helped with something that's happening there. So it's a donation, it's a punt, it's a feel-good.
But those money would probably be better off given to a charity who could then do real due diligence and give that money to the most promising research.
Well, what's the difference between a peer-reviewed piece of development that we funded through Andrew Bostrus at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and a charity. And, you know, we're a charity, we funded that. You know, what's the difference?
Your average person on the street can't understand necessarily or to have the resources to do due diligence. So how on earth would that lead to resources going to the most promising projects?
Yeah. I think that lack of understanding is a very good point, actually, and that's the reason it's not taken up so much in this sector so far, because people understand a widget more than they do something about molecular biology or whatever. And that absence of understanding is a major issue there. And I think in terms of this sector, it's medical devices more than drug development is going to hit crowdfunding more successfully. And things like antibiotics or vaccines that most people generally understand the concept of because they've had them themselves, they'll maybe manage to trigger something as well. But there will be, I think, many things within life sciences that are too complex or too many unknown factors for the general public to really hook into it. So I think that's true, actually.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for 2 to 3 more. If you're voice
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
There's a gentleman in the middle there with the purple tie. Who has his hand up? Sorry. Oh, no, maybe not. Okay, so down to the front here, this gentleman in the second row, and then... Yeah, thank you. I was going to have to sort that out.
You want me now? My name's Keith Peters. I'm a senior consultant at GSK, and I was the head of the Cambridge Medical School for 18 years. Just want to make this point about crowdfunding. We've actually had this for a long time. For example, British Heart Foundation, Arthritis and Rheumatism, Cancer Research UK, all these patients know, and the patients are very influential in determining the donations to these organisations. And actually, the UK is one of the most philanthropic organisations in the world. And that's reflected in the strength and scale of these organisations. And I think the point that the Wellcome Trust representative made about making sure the money is well spent is really important. And I do think, although I admire your example of the portable ophthalmoscope, retinal camera, that is so unrepresentative of the real problems of drug discovery. When an average new drug costs $1.5 billion to make, you're in 0.1%, 0.001% of the real world, actually.
I'd entirely agree that widgets like that one are at one end of the scale for crowdfunding, and drug development is way over there at the other end of the scale. I completely agree with that.
I don't like to kick someone when they're already down, but just to build on this point, my name's Eric Carron. I'm from Alzheimer's Research UK. We recently got a proposal in to do some drug discovery from a academic institution in the UK. It was very, very thoroughly critiqued, went through due diligence both with AI UK and MRC technology, and we rejected it for a whole host of reasons. And subsequently, we found out that that academic institution is now using crowdsourcing to try and fund that project, which I really think is a complete waste of money. So I'd like to echo this other point.
Yeah, I'll say it again.
It sounds like a great concept.
It's one tool in the box, but it's not the answer to everything.
Okay. No, I think we've got to... Miranda, just a quick one then.
A syndicate room based in Cambridge offers a bridge for what we've been talking about, and that is that crowdfunders can invest alongside in projects which have already had due diligence carried out by experienced investors.
That's interesting.
So that might be help to your project
good
in the
model.
future.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Claire, for a very fascinating discourse there. I'm sorry, there were a lot of hands there that we couldn't address, so please catch Claire during lunch and the afternoon sessions as well. So I'd like to invite Professor Ray Hill onto the stage with his panel as well. Before his retirement from Merck in 2008, he headed a group within the company aimed at establishing beneficial relationships within European pharmaceutical companies, biotechs and academic institutions across therapeutic areas and platform technologies. So I'll hand you over to Professor Hill. Thank you.
Right, thanks very much. So if the panel would make their way forward while I'm perhaps just take a couple of minutes to make some introductory remarks. And I think there's a lot of confusion about this whole issue of collaborative research, and perhaps it's a sign of advancing years, but I think we certainly ought to remember it's not new. And when we come to patient benefit, probably a very good example of what we're now calling open innovation that led to real patient benefit was just before and during the Second World War, when academic groups and industry worked together to make penicillin a reality as a drug. And a lot of the issues around commercial interests that normally would have got in the way of collaboration between very important companies like Lilly and Merck in the UK, and what became the Beecham Company in the UK environment, were really sort of pushed out of the way, and the patient need was what dominated. And perhaps that's something that we've rather forgotten, that where there is something that's very important from the patient's perspective, perhaps that's the thing that we should really be all working together on. Now, if we look at the collaborative map, when I joined the pharmaceutical industry in the early 1980s, I think you could say that the Venn diagram of the interaction between academia, what then was an embryonic biotech industry, and big pharma was dominated by a much bigger blob for the pharmaceutical industry than for the other two participants. And I think looking at it now, we have a situation where those blobs are of equal size, and you could argue that the size of the pharmaceutical industry blob is actually getting smaller with all of the consolidation and the decisions to do research in whole therapeutic areas outside the company. And then, as Keith reminded me just now, perhaps in the UK we shouldn't be thinking of 3 blobs but 4, and it's more of a square, with the NHS being the 4th blob. And obviously very important things are already happening in terms of patient stratification and participation of NHS patients in clinical trials. And I think this can only increase as we go forward. So we've got a very interesting environment, but in the context of collaboration always having been important, and you could argue that all we've done with initiatives like the SBC is do more of what we already knew to be successful. I think I'd like to start by asking the panel if they know any examples that fit the remit we were given, which was to simply look at what's going on in collaborative research and see whether any of this really has got from the beginning to the end, or are we still looking at potential? And then I'll come back to, if we haven't actually gone all the way with some of these initiatives, why is that? Is it simply because it takes a long time to make an idea into a drug? Or are there ways we could do things, rather like the urgency that was imposed on us by the Second World War, that would actually make things move forward more quickly to the real benefit of the patient? So in no particular order, I said I'd take the panel in the order they were seated. So on my left here, as Eric has the misfortune to sit closest to me, can I ask Eric to start off and give us, if you can, an example of where you think this sort of interactive research has been successful?
Well, I think you have to go back a long while to see, and you mentioned it actually, one I know about, which was the collaboration with the Eli Lilly struck with academia to get the patent for insulin, which was then put into mass production. I've seen that agreement actually. It's in Lilly's museum in Indianapolis, and it's just one side. I hate to think what an equivalent agreement between pharma and academia would look like now for something that became a billion-dollar medicine. I guess another one that I can think of, and maybe those who are associated with CRUK will be able to give a better flavour of this, is the abiraterone, which came out of the CRUK labs, was put into a small biotech called Cougar Pharmaceuticals, ultimately bought by J&J for about $1.9 billion, and is now on the market for prostate cancer. So I think that is an example where an idea came out of academia and then went into small biotech, large biotech, and ultimately to success in the clinic. A recent analysis that was in Nature Reviews Drug Discovery looked at a number of drugs and tried to map out their provenance. And from that, it looked like big pharma developed twice as much as they discovered, which is, I think, what you think would be the case. But from academia, around 18% of the drugs, and I think the cohort was around 800 drugs that they looked at, had actually originated in not-for-profit academic labs. And so, and ultimately they got developed most probably by others. So I think there is certainly a path forward for that. Whether or not that fits within open innovation per se, I don't think it does, because generally one needs to have secured some sort of patent in order to ensure that someone else will invest in that to develop it and get a return. So I'll pass
Thank
on
you,
to
Eric.
Mike.
So, David.
Okay. Sorry, I'm Dave Topolsky, Chief Executive Medical Research Council Technology. We're the tech transfer arm of the Medical Research Council, but completely independent from the Medical Research Council. We are actually a charity in the UK, which allows us to operate in open innovation in a, I would say, more relaxed fashion than perhaps if we were driven by shareholder ownership, where there will be a drive clearly to return value to the shareholders and make money. Our drivers differ. I mean, there's nothing wrong with us making money, but we don't exist to make money. If we make money as a consequence of our activities, that's great, because we can invest it in more medical research, and more medical research translation, I should say. And the kind of example I'd give you, I think, is actually one that we've done with Eric and his team in Dementia Consortium, where we pulled together, I think it was 2 pharma companies, Lilly and
2 and counting.
2 and counting. Eisai, Lilly, Alzheimer's, MRCT, saying, look, the world is going to suffer from an ever-increasing problem with dementia, and we really need to try and solve this somehow. So let's have a look at how we can bring the resources of big pharma, the charity sector, together to try and solve an area of unmet medical need in a collaborative and open innovation fashion. It's not in the truly pre-competitive space either. So we are looking to develop drug discovery programs that will lead to clinical research programs. So I think that's a reasonably good example of a new example of open innovation in the UK. We have another one in MRCT, which is called NeuroMap. If you go to our website, you'll be able to search it for the initiative NeuroMap, which actually brings together UK and US charities and pharma companies to look at neurodegeneration as an area of unmet medical need and how we can make an impact for patient benefit there. So I think there are increasing examples of this. The fact that open innovation, as Ray mentioned, really kind of started driven by the needs of the war and competition with the German pharmaceutical industry, which actually was racing ahead of us, is probably something that we shouldn't lose, because Britain as a whole is actually, or shouldn't be rather, competing with itself, but actually competing with the world. And Malcolm made a very valid and I think very pertinent point in his last panel, which was, if we don't have fundamental investment in basic biomedical research in this country, we won't have biotech, we won't have big pharma investment in this country. And without those three, or sorry, without the latter two, why on earth would the British government continue to invest in basic biomedical research if it wasn't going to see a return on that investment in patient health, economic return in jobs created and so on here in the UK? So I think it is a fragile ecosystem. We do have big pharma still in the UK, but I can certainly vouch from my experience we've got a lot less of it now than we used to have. I'm a similar vintage to Ray, and when I left Oxford to go into the pharma industry, I wrote my CV off to, I think it was 26 international pharmaceutical R&D companies with research headquarters or establishments here in the UK. My son's going to do chemistry, unfortunately, at university this year. I say unfortunately, I'm joking, but he's going to do chemistry at university. By the time he leaves, we may have 3. So, it's important that we protect that ecosystem somehow. And I think, actually, open innovation is one mechanism. If we can make open innovation work, big pharma will want to be here. We've seen evidence of that already in the UK. Pfizer are putting their very early preclinical pharmaceutical innovation group into the UK now. They had a chance, or they looked at doing it about 5 years ago, but chose not to. They chose to put it into Cambridge, Massachusetts, into San Diego, into New York. They very recently decided to put it right next door to the Crick in London, which I think is a very powerful message for the value of placing research in the UK. We have J&J doing similar things, Eli Lilly doing similar things. So I think the environment here is good, and I think a way of helping continue to foster that environment is through maximising the benefit of open innovation here in the UK. Barbara.
Good, thank you, David. Barbara.
So my name is Barbara Domain-Hayman. I'm Chief Business Officer of Ortiphany Therapeutics. I'm also acting chairman of a company called Puridify, which is based here at SBC. In addition to that, the last 2 years I've been entrepreneur in residence at the Stevenage Bioscience Catalyst, and I've been involved in a number of strategic projects as well as mentoring the early stage companies. And one of those projects was actually to be heavily involved in the Open Innovation Challenge for neurodegenerative disease. Now, I don't share the illustrious R&D background that my fellow panellists have. I come from a really commercial perspective, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the Open Innovation Challenge that we've run at SBC this year, because there have been a couple of allusions to it earlier on, but I think it's probably time that we actually say a little bit more about it, and also to give a bit of a trailer for Bev's session. Beverly Vaughan's running a session directly after the lunch break, where you can learn much more of the detail of how it was actually run. So neurodegenerative disease was selected as an area because of basically the huge unmet need. But I think we were very conscious that we didn't want to do something that was going to overlap or duplicate the actual quite substantial amounts of funding that were already going into that area. And SBC basically said, we're going to put a pot of 40,000 quid in, and the TTOs were going to match that potentially. And these are small amounts of funding, so we needed to check whether these small amounts of funding were actually going to make any difference. And we tested that with a number of academics, and the answer was very definitely yes, it would make a difference. Because, for instance, academics, they get major grants, but for when they've got those grants, they have to do the work on those grants. They can't explore things that are tangential to that. So this funding could actually enable them to explore slightly interesting areas, generate some data that they could then get a more major grant from. And then also, for instance, early career researchers, not yet on that grant treadmill, but they need to be able to generate some data to be able to get essentially enough data to get one of those major grants. So yes, the small amounts of money, obviously it would be better if it was more, but small amounts of money can be catalytic, they can make a difference. So as Claire alluded to earlier, we worked with Mimit on this, and Mimit have a framework whereby they basically have run competitions like this to award funding. And they have the connections into the academic health science centres. So Mimit organised some brainstorming sessions whereby basically they identified areas of unmet medical need. Obviously, in neurodegenerative disease, it's an extremely long shopping list. So came up with this enormous list of potential areas. And Ray, in his role as on the expert panel, very kindly helped us to boil that down to 2 areas, one of which was around biomarkers for diagnosis and stratification of neurodegenerative disease. And the other area was inflammation and neurodegeneration. So both very hot areas. So we launched the challenge, and we had actually checked with industry at this point that were these 2 themes actually of interest. And they were definitely, yes, this is an interesting area. We weren't asking industry for money at that point, but they basically said, yes, this is interesting. So basically, we put the challenge out there. We got actually 19 applications, which was about the right number that we could actually handle. And then basically we had a workshop with a boiled down 14 applicants came to the workshop. And that was a highly interactive session. The idea was for the applicants to interact with each other, potentially collaborate with each other. And some of those actually did start to do collaborations, not having worked with each other before. So from that workshop, we then actually had 14 very interesting applications, and we went to industry and we went to some of the research charities and we said, look, this is what we've got already, but we've only got 2 very small pots of funding. Can you add to that so we can actually fund more of these very promising applications? And as a result of that, those conversations, we actually ended up with fantastic support from sponsors. So we got GSK, Lilly, 2 big pharmas. We got GE Healthcare. We got Alzheimer's Research UK. And interestingly, we also got Astex, who were recently taken over by Otsuka. So we had a really interesting set of, I would say, unusual suspects in terms of the sponsors that were actually prepared to back this. And then we had after the workshop, we then boiled it down to a short list And just before Christmas, we actually awarded, made 6 awards. So that's the background. So I think what we're trying to do with this open innovation is it's not just about the pots of money. It's about bringing together unusual suspects. It's about what people said earlier on about it's not a jigsaw puzzle with definite boundaries. This is definitely something that's got pretty fuzzy boundaries at the moment. We're not quite sure where it will evolve, but we've got the ingredients in the pot. We've got 6 great academic groups that have got funding awards, and we've got an interesting bunch of sponsors, and we're trying to catalyse interactions between them. And I mean, clearly we're aiming for patient benefit, but this is obviously at the beginning of an interesting process that we have a long way to run. So Beverly will be running a session just after lunch to tell anyone who's interested more about it.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, Barbara. I think I'll answer the exam question first, but I think Barbara's got something really interesting, which is how we identify more of the outstanding science that can be translated, and what are the mechanisms that we can talk about. So I am David Roblin. I'm Chief Operating Officer and Director of Scientific Translation for the Francis Crick Institute. I am a poacher turned gamekeeper. I was originally a physician, then spent nearly 20 years in big pharma with Pfizer and Bayer, and then I suppose 4 years in smaller biotechs. So I kind of fit in your 4 buckets, Ray. So perhaps that gives me a certain line of sight. And the line of sight tells me actually that most drugs that are launched have been based on collaboration. And Eric touched on it. When you look at provenance, and to generalise, the basic science is often done in academia. The drug development is done in big companies. And there's a reason, because of the level of investment that's required to bring a drug forward, and the capital that's deployed for a decade or so is extensive. And Keith mentioned when he made a point. So I think that's important, but we're talking about open innovation, and again, there's a reflection. When I left the NHS and crossed to the dark side to work for Pfizer, I was recruited as part of a war for talent, and the notion was that Pfizer, because it was growing, could attract all of the very best people and put them in 2 sites in Groton and Sandwich, and they'd solve world health. So I was obviously flattered to be recruited, but arrived, looked around, and of course I didn't find all of the smartest people, and of course most of the smart people were still outside the boundaries. So and this journey in open collaboration, I think dates back in the way we're talking about open innovation, where people are working together really for the benefit of making outstanding scientific insights. I was involved in the pre-competitive work in Europe, which has often been much maligned, the Framework 6 and Framework 7 work that ultimately became IMI. And the IMI was signed in 2006, which actually is not that long ago. And there was an audacious, actually, pre-competitive agenda that the industry signed up to, of investing 2 billion, 1 billion from the industry and 1 billion from Europe in a pre-competitive space that actually hadn't largely been defined at the time. There were some broad ideas. That money's been spent. I think there's still a question. You asked, has it been successful? I think there's still a question. I understand that there will soon be publications that are showing that it is successful. It was successful in getting industry to talk to each other. And I think this actually happened somewhat before the move in the US. And the US had various initiatives like the Critical Path Initiative, which also encouraged open innovation and communication. So I still hope for success there, and I'm looking for the publications, the quality of the science that will emerge, and wait for the publication. But that did, I think, change the view of a lot of big farmers in what was the pre-competitive space and how far it could extend. And I think it could extend all the way to target validation. because there are far too many chemicals progressing to test mechanisms, and I think that's too competitive, because we arrive in phase 2 with a 20% success rate, usually with a molecule that could become a medicine. And that doesn't seem to be a sensible stage. So I think I'd finish just to say what attracted me to the Francis Crick Institute was actually the extraordinary collaboration that's put it together. So we are funded by substantial charitable funding. The CRUK fund us, the MRC fund us, the Wellcome Trust fund us, and 3 of the large London universities, UCL, Imperial and King's. So at its heart, it's an extraordinary collaboration. We want to collaborate to create outstanding science, a flagship for the UK. We're going to focus on bringing clinical science in, bringing multidisciplinarity, so bringing engineering, physics, chemistry, maths and computational skills really close to biological hypothesis testing. And we're going to bring industry in, because I think the mixture of applied science and, for want of a better term, curiosity-driven science can work really well together. And that would also be something, I think, that links to Barbara's points, which is worth exploring.
Thanks very much. So before I bring the rest of the audience in, I'd like to just dig a little deeper into some of these issues, because clearly I think everyone would agree that there have been extremely successful collaborations. But I think there are a number of drivers that we could perhaps see as being critical for this. I mean, one is leadership. And we had the example of the Dementia Consortium. And I mean, this is something that could have happened with people, just bumping into each other at the coffee machine. But, when the relevant university groups, for example, are several hundred miles apart, I mean, it's hard enough to actually persuade people to talk to someone who works on the next floor in the same building sometimes. So I think that sort of leadership provided by a couple of charities, I mean, can be really crucial, and I'd be very interested in the rest of your views. And also, the other point that perhaps coupled with that is the funding one. And I think we had one example from Barbara, the idea of using starter grants that are awarded in competition in areas that are very topical and of high interest. And I think that, really is something worth more thought. And then, the overarching thing, and perhaps the most important thing that's been mentioned, is to ensure that there is this continued funding of biomedical research in the UK at a fully competitive level. And, if that doesn't happen, then I think everything else we talk about is irrelevant. So if I could perhaps start in reverse order and start with you, David. And, what do you think leadership is crucial, or is it just providing the environment and letting it happen?
No, leadership is definitely important. And I don't think the IMI would have happened in the way it did without Jonathan Knowles spearheading it. He definitely pushed that and specifically pushed the audaciousness of it. I thought it was too big at the time because, of course, very little pre-competitive work was being done, but Jonathan said it's got to be bold, and it was bold, and I think we will see impact from that. I think we require leadership from both academia and industry, and in a sense, there's an act of faith here which says if you work together in an open, innovative environment, then good things will happen. And it should be done in a very open way. In the very early areas of drug discovery, or biology discovery actually, where the Crick will work, there's often very little intellectual property. The race is to publish, make the information available, so we and others can exploit. And I think that'll have to be the push. And I'm asking some of the big pharma colleagues, and I'm talking about big pharma, but I'd like to talk about biotech and how they engage here as well, because I think there's a different problem, to place an act of faith actually in the Crick laboratories, to put people who are always asking questions of application in the laboratories that Barbara spoke of, which are following sometimes a route to understanding of basic biology that sometimes doesn't naturally link to something that is translatable. But I think if someone in the labs is asking the question, is that insight translatable, then we'll have a larger number of insights that are potentially applicable. And if those individuals are in the labs, they will also be able to help write the business plan, maybe do the 1 or 2 experiments with some of the funding that Barbara was talking about. I'm a great fan of the MRC's Confidence and Concept Fund and Proximity Discovery Fund. I think it's absolutely what's required now to bring people together. But ultimately, it is an act of faith. It's an act of faith that there will be more science generated, higher quality science generated, which then it can be exploited.
Thank you. Barbara.
Yeah, I so much agree with so many of those points, actually. I mean, I think leadership is absolutely critical. I mean, the Open Innovation Challenge that we were running with SBC has got off to a really good start, and I mean, I think it's all gone really well. That doesn't mean to say that there weren't some challenges along the way. And I think, you know, one of the challenges was, you know, obviously in working with the tech transfer offices, they have different metrics, they have different concerns. And there is obviously a degree of concern around confidentiality and intellectual property. And it was not so much the fact that, I mean, that there's anything that I think people felt was commercially valuable in the applications they already had, because they're at a very early stage. But there was a lot of concern about, is there a potential for them to somehow compromise their ability to file future IP by giving things away at this point? And the people that are involved in those TTOs, obviously, they have careers to worry about. And they can see for themselves, I think, and I mean, this is certainly not a criticism, but you can see that there's a concern about a downside risk where if I make a decision to do this and it somehow compromises the ability of the academic to file IP later on, what's that going to do to my career? And that's you're coming back to the mismatch in timescales again, because the benefit from the open innovation is likely to be quite long in coming. I think it will come and it will be enormous, and it will outweigh any minor concerns around IP filing. But in the short term, the person that's dealing with that transaction has to make that judgment call, and they are obviously concerned about it. And I think the way that that can be overcome is obviously by leadership at the top of the TTOs and ultimately the top of the academic institutions saying, yes, we realise that there are some risks in doing this. It is an act of faith, but we realise that the benefits will be greater, and not to get hung up about the details of confidentiality and, oh my God, there's a risk to potentially some IP here. So I think it is absolutely about leadership and an act of faith.
Thank you. David.
I agree with everything that's been said. Basically, I think you can't really do drug discovery and open innovation unless you have the right environment for it. So I think the environment, such as those provided by SBC here at Stevenage, are critical. Proximity, as Ray's mentioned, is important. You know, I'm a chemist, so one of the things you learn as a chemist is you want to get a chemical reaction to go faster, compress the molecules, because they're going to collide more often. And it's part of that how innovation happens. Innovation happens around coffee machines. Why? Because people collide with each other. So, you know, the more people you can get into those kind of, inverted commas, collisions, the more likelihood there is going to be a couple of sparks that emerge, new ideas, and that could lead on to maybe a new business plan or potentially a new collaboration between two companies that have occupied the same building but never really spoken. So I think environment's really important. The role of leadership really can't be underestimated. It is vitally important that you have people who are willing to take chances, people who are willing to give up potentially very lucrative careers in major pharma companies to go and start their own businesses, and actually to do that in a serial fashion. We're not as good in the UK as the US in that perspective, actually. In the US, it's quite common to see an entrepreneur who started 15, 20 companies. Some of those companies have failed, some of them have succeeded, some of them have been very big, and they may have made a hell of a lot of money doing it. In the UK, it's slightly more common to find somebody doing a start-up, making 5, 10 million quid, and then retiring to a chateau in France, rather than gamble it all on the next venture they want to start. So I think leadership, environment are critical. I think with the leadership comes a kind of almost a sense of belief that you need to have, which is the best summed up, I think, by a quote from Henry Ford, which goes along the lines of, it doesn't matter whether you believe you can do something or you believe you can't, either way, you're probably right. And most successful entrepreneurs I've met have always had the belief that they were right and that they will succeed. Because the minute they start questioning that, they start having doubts and they think about giving up, and then a job advert comes up, hopefully in a big GSK or an AstraZeneca, and off they go back to the safety of corporate environment, or the relative safety of corporate environment. Come on, you've been here 35 years now, Malcolm. So I think the environment, the leadership, yes. Finance, you can't underestimate the importance of finance and the importance of having flexible finance. You know, if I'm starting a company, I wouldn't necessarily look at a VC immediately. Whether it's crowdfunding, whether it's angel funding, there are multiple sources of funding that you can start companies with. I've started 7 companies in my career, 3 trade sales, 1 AIM listed, 1 went bust, and 2 still going. And not one of them was started with VC money. They were all started with angel or personal friends money. Ultimately, some of those companies did take in VC money, but only when we'd reached a value inflection point whereby the money became relatively cheap to acquire. So finance is critically important. The UK is not bad as a source of finance, actually. That might be my phone interfering with it. The UK is not bad as a source of financing. The difficulty in the UK is actually not getting the 1 million, 5 million kind of ballpark. The difficulty might be getting the 10,000, 50,000 pot of money that you just need to do the key experiment to show whether you're right or wrong. So the kinds of schemes that David's referred to, Barbara's referred to, are vitally important in just allowing an academic to see whether there is a kernel of an idea that warrants further investigation and so on. I think the other thing is we can't expect all of our academics to become entrepreneurs. That's not what they're there for in many respects. You know, they're there because they want to do blue sky research. If they wanted to do translatable research, they'd probably be working in a pharma company in our particular area or discipline. So actually, as David said, it's having 2 sorts of people present in the same environment. Those that just want to concentrate on the basic biomedical research, the Nature papers, hopefully the Nobel Prize, and those that look at that work and say, I can do something with that, and I can do something that's of patient benefit with that. So actually, coming back to environment, having those 2 in the same environment actually will facilitate and catalyse that, in my belief anyway, that innovation. Thank you. Yes, so last word.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on some of these. Ray, you mentioned that Dementia Consortium was something that could have just been started over a cup of coffee. As a person who did start it, it didn't actually seem that easy at the time, and it hasn't been that easy. So it has been a challenge to get all that going. I'd like to just talk about the concept of innovation coming about because you have a different admixture of talent and people and perspectives, because I think that's important. And I think the world has really changed here with respect to the perspective of academia and the perspective of industry. And if you go back sort of 20 years, maybe not as far as that, academics' view of people in industry was generally that they were very well paid but very stupid, and that's why they weren't good academics. And in industry, the view of academia was, you know, you do a whole load of pointless research, and by the way, none of it replicates in our labs anyway. And I think that situation is really changing now. And I think, you know, I've worked with some incredibly smart people and still do in industry and also in academia. It's just that they are, you know, have a different approach to certain things, but nevertheless, I think they can work incredibly productively together. And one of the things that we've been trying to do, and we've heard, you know, and Dave said, academics, we shouldn't expect them to want to do translational research. But one of the things AR UK is trying to do is get the best of both worlds. So we're establishing 3 drug discovery institutes in 3 major institutions in the UK, academic institutions. And in this model, we will be funding via the university around 30 scientists, equally split between life scientists and medicinal chemists. And their role is really to do translational biology and look for drug targets and validate them and get lead molecules. But they are embedded, literally and metaphorically, within the academic institution. The grants for this, and they're going to receive, each institution will receive 10 million for this. The grant is given to the lead academic scientist, but the responsibility for spending that money is given to the chief scientific officer who will run the DDI. So the system is set up for the 2 to collaborate and have to collaborate to make a success of it. We're not asking the scientists within the DDI to have to publish papers and get grants, although that will be good. And we're not asking the academics to do the drug discovery, for which they're often singularly ill-equipped, both in terms of previous experience and temperament, because a lot of drug discovery is actually routine work, doing the same thing over and over again with very high precision, so that the assay you run year 1 is the same as the assay you run year 5. And so we're trying to look at this sort of mixed model to try and accelerate the flow of innovation from academia into drug discovery targets.
Thank you very much. So I'll just mention one other factor which I think is relevant to all this and which has been sort of touched on in discussion but hasn't been made explicit, and that's the issue of permeability. And I think that's particularly relevant in the US-UK comparison, because I mean, it's very common in the US for people to move between academia and industry and back again. It also seems to be a lot easier for people to keep their academic titles while also running a company. And I'm not sure that we've actually worked hard enough at this. And I know there are various schemes in place to allow people to spend periods in their alternate environment, either moving from industry into academia or vice versa. But I'm not sure we actually, you know, work hard enough at making people realise that it's not either or, and you can have a very productive life flitting back between the two. And so I'll give you that as another discussion topic. So, comments from the floor? Yes, yeah, yeah.
My point is, it's high quality science in both sides. So we tend to talk about curiosity driven, and I did it in applied science, but in the end, it's high quality science. Yeah. And to your point, I stumbled across an address by, I think it was the Surgeon General. I couldn't get the paper on my way here, who was talking about MIT, and 1/3 of faculty there had spun out at least one company. So one third. Yeah. So there's a clustering effect in the set of experiences, of knowledge, of networks that I think we struggle to get in the UK. I think that there's some of that happening in Oxford and Cambridge, not enough in London, but that is a definitive area that we can. So I didn't want to give the impression that a academic couldn't be a really good applied scientist. Absolutely. And vice versa.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Okay, well that's a nice summary. So, comments from the floor, please. Yes, please, sir. Yes. Start at the top.
Colin Dollar, GSK. I just wanted to mention 2 GSK initiatives. They're both in the public arena. The first one is what we call Discovery Fast Track, where for each of the last 2 years we've advertised in North America, mainly in the United States, or in Europe, mainly in the UK, to universities and institutes saying, if you've got an idea of a disease entity where you think it would be possible, because we know enough about its etiology, to be able to intervene with a drug, but we don't have any drugs. The prize we offered, if we thought it was a really good idea, then we would give them a free high-throughput screen with no commercial commitment whatever. And there was a short list went through, and in each case we had about 16 which are shortlisted, and about half of those were given a high-throughput screen. And the applications were really of very high quality in some cases. The other thing is that we could become involved. If we thought they were a really good idea, we would go and offer much heavier support, but that would have involved a joint agreement. Yeah. The other areas, which I'm sure you know about, is that Patrick Valence, particularly, our head of R&D, triggered this arrangement with the EBI and the Sanger called CTTV, which is really to try and look at the very basic area of target identification. And with the Sanger, as well as the big database of EBI, being able to test those ideas up to a certain level, certainly up to cell level, maybe up to small animal level. And that's open. Other companies can join, other people can join it. And I think both of these are strong incentives, because we're putting quite a lot of people and quite a lot of money into that to really get it going.
Thank you very much, Colin. Shock silence, no more comments? Oh, yes, thank you.
I do have one. Marek, Till from the Innovation Forum again. Do you think, are there any alternatives to IP protection as we know it now?
Well, it's a contentious question, isn't it? I mean, I think the thing about IP is knowing when to file or if to file, isn't it? And I mean, my own feeling is that there are some areas where a trade secret might be more appropriate than IP. I mean, particularly in the medical device area, for example. And I think that it's part of the technology transfer education in universities that, I mean, something that was a bit of a hobby horse of mine when I ran the licensing group for Merck, was that an informative, non-confidential disclosure seemed to be something that was very hard for people to write, where in fact you can put almost everything in, bar the chemical structures, and so people can do a thorough review of what your idea is long before you have complications of IP. And so I think IP is essential, but at the same time, you can be informative without giving IP secrets away. So I think that is one alternative, is, you know, just to draw the boundaries, and I'll throw it open to the rest of the panel.
Certainly, Chaz Bounter in Oxford has got this model, Structural Genomics Consortium, I think, where he's received significant funding from pharma and others, and their model is to produce targets almost agnostic of the literature, actually, find lead molecules against those targets, and then publish those lead molecules to try and promote additional work in those areas. And I think he's had certainly some success around bromodomain compounds, which has sponsored other companies to go and try and get IP or different IP from that. So that is, I think, a very interesting model. I think it still remains to be seen whether that will succeed in the long run. But that's one I know of. Please.
I think to a degree it depends on your governance structure as an organisation. So if you are a PLC or a biotech funded by venture capital, you know, you have a requirement to generate a return on investment for your founders, shareholders, etc. Which means at some point you've got to be able to commercially exploit what you've discovered. And the only way you can do that really is also to protect yourself from others exploiting what you've discovered. If, on the other hand, your governance structure is that of, for example, a charity, if the charity doesn't require money to survive, then there isn't necessarily the need to patent, because to achieve your impact, societal impact, simply publishing what you find so that others can go and commercialise it and make all the money may be sufficient. Of course, there's still a balance, because if that's all you do as a charity and you cannot collect sufficient income from the public or other sources, then you go out of business. And actually, it's not a good thing for charities to make themselves, in effect, redundant. So the longer they can continue, the better they can have societal impact. So I think there's a balance to be achieved, but I think some of that is driven by your corporate governance.
Yeah, anything to add?
Yeah, interesting subject. I mean, Ray, I completely agree with you. I think one can disclose an enormous amount and have a meaningful discussion without actually compromising confidentiality. And I think all companies, all early stage companies, need to have the ability to do that. And I'm also a huge fan of the things like the Structural Genomics Consortium, which I think is a very interesting initiative. I think it is horses for courses, though. There are certain situations where it is obviously very sensitive. And in fact, yesterday I was having first meeting with, there's a business plan competition called One Start, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is a great initiative which really stimulates young people to go and set up companies and compete in this business plan competition, which has got a very meaningful prize of £100,000. And I had my first mentoring meeting with the group I'm working with this year. And they're actually struggling with the dilemma of, you know, we really want to disclose this information because it's important for the competition. But actually, if we disclose our idea, there is a real risk that someone will actually take that idea and run with it. And they don't yet have any money or anything to be able to take it forward themselves. So I think there are situations where IP is obviously a big dilemma. And I think it just depends on the particular situation.
Yes, I think, well, just a reflection that the bulk of the patterns that matter and drive sales in the industry are those around molecules. And I don't see any solution in the near term for the requirement for intellectual property for companies like GSK to put £1 billion down over 10 years to develop a drug. So I think it's absolutely fundamental. I think, Ray, your points are really well made and very pertinent to the discussion on open collaboration. So I think there's a level of sophistication about knowing what intellectual property is that drives a patent versus what is scientific knowledge that could be shared, and by sharing it you learn more and move your project further forward quicker. Just a little story on this. The industry had the view that holding these things in, this knowledge, was somewhat of benefit. So I looked at the publication of patents following what we thought were first-in-class molecules, and this was Pfizer work that I didn't publish. So we looked at JAK3, alpha-2 delta ligands, and what we found is these things that we thought that because we had the knowledge and the information, we were way ahead of the rest. So within the first patent on JAK3, within 3 months, 12 other companies had patented. Within a year, 70. So the reality is the scientific information is very permeable. And what we companies need to do, what biotechs need to do, and I know this is a very sort of therapeutic focused comment, is really compete to find the best molecule or the best biological.
Yeah. Thank you. Malcolm.
I just wanted to follow up on Eric's point about the SGC, because it's kind of ironic how things have gone full circle. The SGC was Glaxo's idea. So we went to the Wellcome Trust 12 years ago. We had 12 companies, and I think this just goes to show how far we've moved. We had 12 companies, including IBM and 11 pharma companies, sitting around the table. We're each going to contribute $3 million to a program to drive the whole thing forward. Once the other companies realised that everything was going to up in the public domain, then it was Brookhaven database, they all fell by the wayside. And the Wellcome Trust, bless them, stepped up to the plate like they always do. They were going to put in $3 million, they eventually put in $18 million. We then worked on it for 4 years together, and we got obviously Toronto and Stockholm involved. Then the other companies came in, a couple came in, gingerly at first. Now, he's pushing them away. There's 8 or 9 companies involved in it. And that to me says how people didn't get it in the early days, but actually now they do.
Thanks very much. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. Perhaps we can follow up any other discussion over lunch. But I think to sum up, you've heard a cogent review of the current situation, but it comes down to those things we've always known were important, which are innovation, money and leadership. So thank you. So just say thank you to the panel. Thank you.
Oh, we're not breaking for lunch yet. Sit down. We'll keep it brief. Don't worry. So this is a very important part of the programme. Barbara talked about the Open Innovation Challenge. So this is the point where we'll celebrate the success of the winners. So I'd like to invite the winners of the Open Innovation Challenge to come up to the stage, and also Martino, who'll be... there are no prizes involved, are you? You're just going to give them a handshake? Okay, nonetheless, that'll be good. So if I can invite the winners up onto the stage. And I'll just provide a little bit more context. Now, Barbara described the process and the aims of the challenge. So this is the Open Innovation Challenge. And so earlier this week, the SBC was delighted to announce that 6 exciting academic research projects have been selected for support under its Open Innovation Challenge in neurodegenerative disease. So SBC ran the challenge in partnership with MIMIT and the technology transfer organisations of the 5 UK academic health science centres, of 5 of the academic health science centres, and the lucky winners will get kickstart funding for their research. So in no particular order, our first winners are from the University of Manchester, looking at a potential treatment for Alzheimer's. So David Brough and Michael Hart, particularly. So perhaps we can celebrate them. So now we've got a group from Cambridge and UCL who are looking at biomarkers in Down syndrome, which is a high-risk group for Alzheimer's. So let's celebrate the success of Anthony Holland and Madeline Walport. And then a group from Imperial looking at screening for cognitive impairment, represented today by Petros Takousis. Okay, and I believe that's all the winners who are here in person. So there are 3 other winners groups, and many congratulations to them too. So we'll be able to hear more about that challenge and some of the projects in one of the sessions this afternoon, which is being led by Beverly Vaughan.
Drawing to
I'm going to draw to a close. Okay.
I just want to say something.
Oh, sure. Okay. So as Martina knows, I like to kind of recap on these events as well. So I'm just trying to draw together the themes. I think we've had some great conversation here with multiple stakeholders looking at the issue and good examples of open innovation. I think key what I thought was embracing risk and uncertainty. We started off with John with his analogy of this isn't a jigsaw where everything fits nicely together and you know what the end picture is. It's very much an evolving area. The requirement to manage risk, and that's risk in terms of money, IP, and also, I'd argue, reputation. It's kind of fear of failure as well behind some of this, which Martina was saying we need to embrace failure and fail early with that. We had the interesting interplay between Glenn and Martino there about whether you need to make money out of this. I would argue that actually generating some money earlier is a good way of de-risking certain elements which are in your control, so enabling you then to take on that further risk. We talked about the unique attributes of the UK, particularly in academia, the people, the nature and the structure of our healthcare environment, and also the legacy from the industry that was here. But I think the last panel also touched upon the fact that that's quite fragile. If you look at what's left of the industry here, it is declining in terms of big pharma presence. So the key messages I saw was really about linking and aligning messages, particularly about the benefit for UK life sciences, raising awareness, and that was raising awareness internally. Kay, you raised the point about academia don't necessarily know who to interact with and how. Raising awareness within the UK. Again, we had the point that the UKTI are very good at looking at internationally how to show the wares of the UK out there, but maybe the UKTI need to run something here within the UK to raise that as well. So to answer the question how far we have come, and I'm taking the journey analogy, I guess, out of respect for Alan with this, is that it's no longer a hypothetical area around open innovation. I think we've seen some tangible examples of where this is beginning to work and how. But I guess with the journey, a lot of people say, well, we've got to have a destination in mind. In my view, the destination is still uncertain, actually, where it might go and continue to change. And what do you do when you've got that uncertainty when you're in the car? Well, you have a very decent satellite navigation system. And so I see the collective group of people around here to guide, steer that sat-nav in terms of embarking on that journey and generating success. So very, very delighted to be part of this conversation, looking at things from the workout groups. Now I'm going to go into some logistics. Did you want to do your bit now, or should I do the logistics?
Do the logistics.
Okay, so just now we're moving over for lunch in the afternoon sessions, which are the SBC, which is just 30 seconds walk across the way there. We won't be coming back here, so please take your coats and bags with you because we'll be spending the rest of the afternoon over that way. And I think that's all for the logistics, apart from me to thank everyone.
Thanks very much, Joe. And please join me in thanking Joe for a great job in facilitating and chairing. I'll come back and summarise later on this afternoon with Joe, but because I know I don't want to keep you from your lunches, I really want to thank you all for coming today. I wanted the folks at the front here to stay with me because it kind of brings us round full circle to where John started us today. These guys would not be sat here had it not been for the foresight and the vision of Alan Baxter. He was the one that took the risk with me to go back to our board, who are also visionary, and were able to take the risk and say, you know what, we should work with Mimit. We don't know where it's going to go. We think it looks like open innovation, but this is what you end up with. And then lo and behold, through Ray, and particularly through Barbara, all of a sudden you've got funders like Eric and GE and others saying, you know what, this might be an exciting thing to do. We don't know where it's going to end. We won't specifically fund one project, but that's how it starts. And I think that whole fear of failure, leap of faith is just so important. So I just wanted to share with you how grateful I am to my former chairman for his foresight and vision. And this is only one example. Okay. Thanks again to Joe, to Malcolm, to Ray, to everybody that's been on the panels. And so to lunch. There are lots of people in the audience who know where they're going. Find one of them. We'll see you over there.